Hello and welcome back to another episode of Wilson Center. Now I'm John Molesky. Joining us today is the director of the Wilson Center's South Asia Institute, Michael Kugelman, and director of the Center's Canada Institute, Christopher Sands. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks for joining us. So today we're going to be talking about the ongoing dispute between Canada and India that was precipitated by remarks made by Prime Minister Trudeau when he talked about a murder on Canadian soil and said intelligence suggests that India was behind that assassination. And if we could, let's begin with today's headlines. On the day that we're making this recording, there was an address before the UNGA meeting where the Indian spokesperson didn't mention Canada. Here's what the AP headline said. It said, India at UN is mum about dispute with Canada over Sikh separatist leaders killing. Michael, was this a surprise?
No, not at all. And I should say that the External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, he did refer to it, though not explicitly. It would have been a big surprise had he brought it up directly, in my view, because for India, its goal at the UNGA meetings has been to focus on India's achievements, its G20 presidency, its recent lunar landing, and had it brought up this issue of Canada's allegations, it would have taken things in a completely different direction. But it is notable that Jaishankar did bring it up indirectly. He didn't refer to Canada, he didn't refer to the U.S., but he basically said something to the effect of, well, it's important that we don't see approaches to terrorism and extremism be taken up by political considerations. So he definitely referred to it, but not surprisingly in a very subtle, indirect way.
Yeah, I have the exact quote here, Michael. He said, the world must not countenance that political convenience determines responses to terrorism, extremism, and violence. So an indirect shot across the bow.
Exactly.
Chris, let's go back to the beginning of this incident where PM Trudeau said about a week ago that India may have been involved in a killing of a Canadian citizen in a Vancouver suburb. Provide us with the background and what Trudeau said.
Sure. Well, the murder took place in June, and it was of a Sikh gentleman who was born in India, but had emigrated to Canada, where he started out as a plumber. He came over as skilled labor and then worked his way up. He had become a leader in his religious community, and he was an advocate for independent Sikh homeland, Khalistan. He was very vocal and outspoken on it. His name, which we should say, was Hardeep Singh Nijjar, and he was well known, certainly to the Modi government, which had put a bounty out on him and criticized for years the Canadian government's refusal to look into Sikh groups in Canada that might have been raising money for terrorism or engaging in plots against India. And so this was all known, but the fact that he was shot in broad daylight at his temple was a bit shocking, certainly for the Canadians. They took a careful look at the evidence, both from the police and gathering intelligence from other Five Eyes countries to try to trace what might have happened, and approached India on it through July and into August. They had several meetings back and forth with the Prime Minister's National Security and Intelligence Advisor, Jody Thomas, making regular visits, exchanging information. And then at the G20, Canada, with the support and help of other Five Eyes countries, including the United States and Australia, pressed the case, saying, we need a better answer than you have nothing to do with this, Prime Minister Modi. What are you doing about it? And Modi was dismissive. So after the G20 summit, Justin Trudeau chose inside the House of Commons to make an accusation. That's very important within the Commonwealth. You don't lie to the House or try to mislead the House. So being in the House of Commons was almost like swearing on a stack of Bibles when he said, I really believe this to be true. And he was applauded by the opposition, which universally supported him in what was really one of the most moving moments, or sort of startling moments, in recent Canadian parliamentary history.
So the decision to not release evidence publicly, we had this comment from U.S. Ambassador to Canada, David Cohen. He says, I'm confirming that there was shared intelligence among Five Eyes partners that helped lead Canada to making the statement that the Prime Minister made. And the Five Eyes, for those who don't know, is an intelligence sharing pact between the U.S., the U.K., Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Why, if Canada has the goods, is it choosing not to release them publicly?
I think what they're doing is trying to keep this behind closed doors, to keep sources and methods discreet. Some of this intelligence did not come from Canada. And so there's always that question of, well, if it came from the Americans or someone else, are we really able to share it? So they've been trying to find a way, I think, in the hope that Modi would say, well, I'm going to de-escalate here. Maybe say I'm outraged that this could have happened, and I'll look into it. I mean, that's really what Canada expected, but the cooperation has been poor. Now, Michael knows India better, but I think from their point of view, they'd been asking Canada to look into the situation with Sikh groups in Canada, and so there was just stubborn refusal to help each other, and that's how this became a much more public dispute.
So, Michael, as Chris is saying, in some ways, this isn't the beginning of the dispute. This is just an escalation where it went public. What has been the relations and the communication between the two countries as it relates to potentially Canada harboring what India refers to as terrorists?
Yeah, well, I would argue that this issue of Sikh separatism, the Khalistan movement, has been a tension point in the relationship for quite some time, even as we've seen some significant levels of growth in the relationship over the last few years, particularly in the trade side. Chris should correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that there was somewhere close to a 60% increase in trade between the two over the last year. And there's also some pretty significant strategic convergences over the issue of China. Canada and India both are very much supporting the U.S. position on the Indo-Pacific and so on. So it's a relationship that's been able to grow despite this tension point that's been there for so long. But I would argue that the reason why things have gotten so much more tense in the months before Trudeau went public with the allegations is from India's perspective, there's been an increase in Sikh separatist activism in India, and India has been very concerned about several incidents over the last few months, including two in the United States, where you had pro-Khalistan activists demonstrating in front of Indian diplomatic facilities. In San Francisco this year, there were two cases where Khalistan supporters tried to start fires and things in front of the Indian consulate in San Francisco. So for India, I think that its longstanding concerns that Canada is not doing enough to address what India regards as a really significant security challenge. It's been heightened by the fact that it's been seeing more of this activism, which it views, quite frankly, even the nonviolent aspects of Khalistan activism. India views that as very dangerous.
Michael, on the individual, the victim, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, designated a terrorist by India. What do we know about this man and how accurate those charges are?
Right. I mean, there's obviously two very different depictions from the Canadian side and the Indian side about him. But indeed, India has accused him of being not a member of, but the actual leader of a violent Khalistan group called the Khalistan Tiger Force, which India has banned it's banned. It's a violent militant group that's been banned. And very interestingly, just in the last few days since the allegations went public, there have been some selective Indian intelligence leaks picked up by various Indian media that paint this picture of Najar being someone who received support from Pakistan and was actually engaged in leading arms training camps in Canada and funding terrorist attacks in India. So, it's hard to know how much of that is true, but from India's perspective, this is a very dangerous figure. I mean, someone who is a bona fide top line, very dangerous terrorist. And one more final point on this: I think for many of us here in the United States and perhaps in Canada as well, and elsewhere in the West, this Khalistan movement thing may seem somewhat obscure, not much known about it. But, if you go back to the 80s and the 90s, there was a full-fledged insurgency, a violent insurgency being waged in India by the Khalistanis that led to significant numbers of deaths. An Indian prime minister was assassinated by two bodyguards of hers who were Sikhs in retaliation for a really bloody Indian crackdown on the Khalistan insurgency. So there's a history here for India that hasn't been forgotten.
Well, and can I jump in on this,
Sure,
John?
sure,
because
please.
One of the big incidents that does touch on Canada was the 1985 Air India bombing, a plane that took off from Montreal on its way to what was then called Bombay, flew over the Pacific and exploded, and it killed all 329 people, almost all of them Indian citizens, instantly. It was until September 11 one of the biggest mass killings by terrorism out there, and it's not disputed that this was something that was done by Sikh terrorist groups and that it had originated in Canada. It could have been a wake-up call, but I think as part of what Michael was saying, this politics of Sikh separatism, it was a bit of a shock. I think most Canadians didn't know anything about it and were surprised to see that it touched on Canada.
Is the criticism, Chris, that Canada has been negligent in potentially harboring dangerous individuals? Is that legitimate?
It's a mixed bag. I think Canada has inherited a very British approach to policing. So as long as you're not disturbing the peace, they've encouraged, sort of as a policy of multiculturalism, communities to have community organizations and to celebrate their ethnic backgrounds while still being Canadian. And that's led to almost separate lives, people who live as part of a community and who, unlike a lot of American migrant groups that sort of leave the politics of the old country behind, in Canada, often the politics of the old country are the politics of the new country. And they ask Canadian politicians, where are you on Khalistan? What are you doing on the Palestinian situation with Israel? And so those kind of conflicts tend to be quite surprising. And as recently as 1982, some 95% of the Canadian population had its origins in either an indigenous background or a European background. So in just really the span of a short human lifetime, we've seen Canada become dramatically more multicultural. And the populations that were Asian born that have come over to Canada have become a real factor in Canadian politics. Justin Trudeau has, I think, currently 3 different Sikh members of cabinet and a number of members of his caucus who have a Sikh background. Now, they're not terrorists by any stretch, but the idea that they are a politically organized community, just as the Ukrainians in Canada are, is very much a factor. And I think that's what's behind the accusations from India that Justin Trudeau is just playing domestic politics and trying to shore up his sagging popularity ratings by being indifferent to their concerns on this issue.
Timing of all of this, gentlemen. Canada's allegations come when India had this diplomatic moment in the sun after hosting the G20 summit, was feeling its oats, is becoming a major player in the world economy. Is there anything we can make of the timing of Prime Minister Trudeau making this dramatic accusation at the time he did? And then what are the implications for India? Did it take the wind out of their sails?
Yeah, I was going to say I'm probably better to talk about the implications, but let's keep in mind that the assassination in Najar happened 3 months ago, right? And there had been a process, there'd been an investigation. Canada was conducting its investigation, and so I definitely, from my perspective, I'd be curious to hear what Chris thinks of this. I don't think that the timing of this, the timing of Trudeau's decision to go public was tied to India's recent achievements and exploits. I mean, I don't think. For all we can talk about the tensions in the India-Canada relationship in recent months, I don't think that Canada would want to see India's moment in the sun from its G20 presidency ruined or anything like that. Canada's a big proponent of the G20 for sure. So, but yeah, I'll be curious to hear what Chris has to say on this.
Well, it's tricky, John and Michael. We're looking at a situation in Canada now where Justin Trudeau's popularity, he runs a minority government, so he only has a plurality, more seats than anyone else in the parliament, but not enough to form an actual majority. His popularity has been in a downward trend for some time. And I think this incident has underscored one of his great weaknesses, which has been foreign policy. A lot of Canadians now are looking around the world and they see very strained relationships between Canada and Russia over Ukraine, Canada and China over the 2 Michaels, Canada and India now over this incident. Canada and pretty much all the major players, there's an issue, with the exception of the United States, where right now things are good, but with the election in 2024 and the offing, who knows who Canadians will face. So they're feeling very alone in the world. I think as a public, they're feeling that they've kind of gone out on this limb. And what's fascinating is that since Trudeau's comments, of course, there was immediate support for the comments, and there's a concern about assassinations, extrajudicial killings on Canadian soil. But peel that back, and what you're hearing now in Ottawa is we have underinvested in diplomacy, underinvested in domestic security, underinvested in defense, and we haven't really even kept up with development spending. We've become a little isolated by our own actions, and now it's crunch time, and the world's a more dangerous place, and our voice is really hard to be heard around the world. So I think it's good. Canadians are not an isolationist people, but they are kind of in a corner, overshadowed by a very large neighbor. And I think they'd like to stand out from the crowd, but right now they don't have the means to do that. And I think that soul searching is one of the political implications that come out of this in Canadian domestic politics.
The U.S. response has been, I don't know what the proper, muted perhaps is one way to describe it. Maybe cautious might be the better word. How has that played in both countries? There was one headline I looked at before we began recording this conversation that suggested the U.S. muted response was hanging Canada out to dry. What has been the response in India? We'll start with you, Michael, to the U.S. response.
I mean, my sense is that the U.S. Response has been quite measured. I mean, the main message has been concern about the allegations and this push to get India to cooperate with the Canadians in the investigation, which has been Ottawa's main ask of India from the start. But indeed, the U.S. And the other Five Eyes allies have been very measured. They have not criticized India. They haven't confronted it. There hasn't been any criticism at all, and we know why. It's because most of Canada's Western allies, certainly those within the Five Eyes alliance, they view India as a critical strategic player, particularly as a counterbalance to China, as an important economic player. It is one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and so many other reasons too that we all know about. So I think that in India, I would argue that there's always been this concern that Canada has not been doing enough to address what for India is security threats. And keeping in mind that almost all of the other Five Eyes allies also are grappling with this challenge of Sikh separatist activism on their soil. I think it's played out most vividly in Canada, but Australia, the UK, and the US, we've seen this as well. And I think one of India's hopes, perhaps in the days and weeks ahead, is that it can try to use this incident, so to speak, regardless of whether it admits it did it or not. And we still don't know. I mean, there's not been any proof put out there of whether India did it or not. But I think India will want to use this as an opportunity to make this argument to the U.S. and other Five Eyes allies that you need to have a better understanding of how dangerous this threat is. Because from India's perspective, the Khalistan movement is making a comeback. Only it's making the comeback from these diaspora communities in the West that, again, comprise most of the Five Eyes allies.
Chris, you see, Michael's a better diplomat than am I because he used the word measured response, which is the better word choice, I think, in depicting how the U.S. has responded. How is the Canadian government feeling about the U.S. response?
Well, it's interesting. Something that Michael said really resonated with me, which is that Canada's business-to-business relationship, the trade and investment relationship, certainly the large Canadian pension funds, they're continuing to be interested in India, and India is particularly glad to have them. So the business relationship's continuing. It's the government-to-government relationship that's been really strained here. And I think Canadian leaders are very pained. They're trying to be measured as well, to try to say, we respect and admire and want to have a relationship with India. Right now, we have a dispute with the government. And it's something that we heard, different times in Canada-US relations. We're not big fans of the American president, but we do have to work with the Americans. And so I think that's the tightrope that Canadians are walking. And most Canadians would be in that space. They don't really know or understand Khalistan politics. They respect India, think it's a great country, and they would like to be a good partner. But right now, I think there's a little shock in Canada's side that Modi hasn't been more willing, that his government has been more willing to take these threats seriously. And as I said at the outset, I think that's tit for tat. It's something that Canada is going to gradually get educated on, but it's not the first time. I think Canada was hopeful of a more peaceful China until the arrest of Meng Wanzhou and the two Michaels. They were hopeful after World War II that we could maintain good relations with the Soviet Union, which was an ally in World War II, until Igor Gouzenko famously defected at the Soviet embassy in Ottawa. So Canada's a relatively peaceful place where people aren't necessarily expecting the worst to happen. I mean, that's a nice thing, but then when they get waken up like this, it can be a bit of a shock, but it does tend to have them looking for ways to keep the best of the relationship while at the same time focusing on the rules-based international order, which is so important for a second-tier player like the Canadians.
The initial reaction to Prime Minister Trudeau's accusation, there was a lot of concern that there could be major disruption among allies. But where we began this discussion, looking at the speeches at the United Nations General Assembly, what we're seeing is a de-escalation. Is that the trend line? Will both countries be doing their best to de-escalate this feud moving forward?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that that moment is now. I mean, temperatures are so high in both capitals, and we've now seen that both countries have issued travel advisories. The UNGA meetings could have provided an off-ramp in a different context, right? I mean, you've got very senior Indian and Canadian diplomats there. You've got, of course, U.S. officials there, and I would argue that there might be some role for the U.S. to play here as a mediator to try to urge both sides to, at the very least, not initiate any new escalatory steps. But I just think that it's too early for that. I mean, we've seen images from from Canada, of some pro-Khalistan supporters, protesting against Modi, tearing up pictures of Modi. And we're not talking about huge numbers, but still, I mean, those images, even if you're talking about a few dozen groups of these folks, that is not that, the optics of that in India, it's not going to be very well received for sure. So I think that in due course, we will see a de-escalation. These are two countries, I think we've discussed this already, that want this relationship to work. And there are a number of areas of strength. And as Chris said before, and as I said, the trade side is really an area for growth. And, India, Canada's a top 20 investor in India. The Indian diaspora in Canada is a fairly sizable one. It's a rapidly growing one. You've got a large number of Indian students in Canada. The people-to-people ties are very strong, and that's what I worry about, though. If you see these images of these relatively small number of Khalistan supporters, tearing up pictures of Modi and things like that, that's not good for the broader picture when it comes to people ties. But I do think that in due course things will calm down, but we're not at that point yet.
Chris, your final thought on where we're headed.
Well, in a way, this is an echo of something we saw during the Cold War, where, France and Germany or France and the British were having a fight over anything, whether it was a trade dispute or a serious strategic dispute. It really benefited the Soviet Union, if only for morale, to see the Allies fighting among themselves. And it usually was a prelude to the Americans stepping in, getting everyone to calm down and imposing some kind of agree to disagree or what have you. That's the challenge of American leadership, that you have to do alliance maintenance. At the end of the day, a fight between Canada and India, if it's prolonged, will only encourage China to see the U.S. alliance system in the Indo-Pacific as one that maybe has some serious fractures in it. And that's the incentive for the United States to get both sides to cool it. You can't always stop that person in the street who's demonstrating and tearing up a picture, but you can ask governments to behave themselves, to measure their responses, and to try to de-escalate the tit for tat. I think the U.S. has been slow to step in on that, but it's inevitable that we'll have to. That's the job of being a leader, and it isn't always fun. But fighting among the allies is not something we can tolerate over time.
Yeah, quick response to that, John. I completely agree with Chris, but it's important to keep in mind that India typically does not like any type of third-party mediation. It doesn't like any outside country to try to intervene in its bilateral and internal disputes, and that certainly includes the Kashmir issue. So that's another challenge. I mean, I think Chris and I both agree that there could be a role here for the U.S. as a third-party actor, but U.S. would have to go about that very carefully just because of India's sensitivities about this type of thing.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for today and for your ongoing coverage of this and other events. I should tell our viewers that if you go to wilsoncenter.org and both the Canada Institute and the Asia program, where the South Asia Institute is housed, You'll be able to find more analysis from both Chris and from Michael, and also from Xavi Delgado of the Canada Institute. Lots to offer. Gentlemen, thanks for today. Thanks for your ongoing work. And to our viewers, we hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thank you for your time and interest.